Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I'm Tracy Carluccio. I'm Deputy Director of Delaware Riverkeeper Network. And one of the things that we work on is water quality and drinking water quality. I work in advocacy at Delaware Riverkeeper Network and have for the last couple decades. And today, I'd like to discuss PFAS. I have a fact sheet actually from New Jersey Department of Health, which has some of the chemical information and specifics and links to more information. So I won't spend a whole lot of time on that. I also have, and we'll discuss at the very end, an action alert. We're asking people to get in touch with Governor Wolf on this issue. But as far as these compounds are concerned, it's really pretty much been taking the nation by storm because nobody knew anything about these compounds. And they've been used for a couple of decades, and mainly, and I'll talk about it a little bit more, mainly in consumer products and firefighting foams. But what has happened is because they are toxic at very tiny doses, and because they don't break down in the environment, they do not biodegrade, and because they build up in the human blood, they have become a very toxic threat to people's health. So as you can see here on this slide, two of those compounds, PFOA, we're going to call it for short, and PFOS, are the most commonly found, particularly in this area, the area of Bucks and Montgomery counties. And they've been found in groundwater, and they've been found in surface water. They've also been found in soil and sludge and sediment and in the air when tested. And that has occurred in Pennsylvania as well, as I said, in many states across the nation. But in Pennsylvania, we have a real problem in Bucks and Montgomery County around the military bases. In Horsham, Warminster, you probably have heard about this. And in the area there of Warrington, Horsham Township, and Warminster, there's a concentration of PFOA and PFOS in drinking water and in the environment that has affected somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 people. And found there as a result of testing that was done by EPA through a monitoring program between 2013 and 2015 are some of the highest concentrations of PFOA and PFOS in the entire United States. And it's because they were released through the use of firefighting foam at the military bases. One of the biggest problems that we're finding as this issue is explored is the more sampling that's done, they seem to find it more. And there's a couple reasons for this. Oops. But first I want to give you an idea of where in Pennsylvania the PFCs for short, or PFAS, is being found. So these are Susquehanna Area Regional Airport is also a military facility there, so that's Harrisburg. Here, north of here in Bucks County, up in Ridge Run Road, and then also in Doylestown Township, it's been found. And then pretty much everywhere they test around military facilities that have used firefighting foams, they're finding it. And so they found it out in Pittsburgh as well. There's nine sites across PA, but I just wanted to point out ones. This is just local. This is really in our region. So everything from the Doylestown Township, Warminster, and the Naval Air Station, all the way through to North Penn, and where the Army Reserve is there, and just where they're looking, they're finding it if there has been firefighting foams used, and then the other major places where they're finding it is manufacturing facilities. Manufacturing facilities.
Do they find it at fire training sites?
Yes, they have found it, not in as great concentrations, but yes, they have found it in non-military firefighting training areas. They've also found it where they manufacture firefighting foams, for instance. So what happened? Like, how did about 100,000 people in our region end up with this in their drinking water? Well, it was used for decades at the military facilities. Almost weekly, they would do firefighting training. They would test different foams. This was a regular occurrence for decades. And actually, there's evidence now that the military knew that these materials that they were using contained toxic substances back as far as the early 1970s, but nothing was ever done about it. And you probably know that there are tens of thousands of unregulated chemicals that are in use in the United States today. And perfluorinated compounds, PFAS, is one of them. The reason it's standing out right now is because, as I said, it does not break down in the environment. And so once it's there, it's called euphemistically forever chemicals. It doesn't go away. So even though it's been phased out as a result of an EPA program, and most manufacturers, all the major manufacturers in the United States do not use it anymore, but they've replaced it with replacement chemicals, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Even though they don't use it anymore, it's still in the environment. And as a matter of fact, in some instances, the levels in drinking water go up, and that's because pollution plumes move through the environment. And there's other reasons as well, and we'll talk about that. But also, it has been used in consumer products. Now, the major exposure pathway is through your drinking water. They found about 60% of the exposure is through drinking water, but you can also ingest it through consumer products such as Orville Redenbacher's popcorn. The inside of the aluminum was coated with PFOA. Stainmaster carpets used as a coating on upholstery and carpets in order to repel water and stains. Teflon, famous one. DuPont was the creator of Teflon, and it was used for many, many years and you probably still have some in your cupboard in cookware. And so those various...
On Netflix about that, by the way.
Pardon?
There's a good documentary on Netflix about that, by the way.
Yes, there's a couple good documentaries out on this. But the consumer products were really very widely distributed. It was 3M who created the firefighting foams and used a lot of the coatings on upholsteries, but it was DuPont that used the Teflon and many of the other applications. And then in manufacturing, it's used, different perfluorinated compounds are used in order to make very durable plastics. Because when something doesn't break down in the environment, what is the attribute that a manufacturer may be going for? Durability, right? So that's what has happened. In the quest for very durable plastics, very hard plastics, they have developed formulas that include PFC compounds. One of them is called PFNA. And the plastics that they make out of that, they use inside jet engines. So it's very, very durable. And that, of course, translates then into not breaking down in the environment. And then, unfortunately, the human body does not break it down well either. So it takes many years for it to go out of your body as well. So that's why we have such a drinking water problem, because it exists, it doesn't go away, people drink it, and even in very tiny amounts, it builds up in the blood. So even if you're drinking very small levels, down to 5 parts per trillion, for instance, of PFOA or PFOS, if you're drinking that amount, it builds up in your blood. And so it magnifies about, according to scientific studies, about 100 times. And that means that you can end up with highly toxic levels in your blood, even though you've only been drinking very small amounts of it. Now, everybody has some PFAS in their blood. Everybody in the United States, about 97% of the population, has about 3 to 4 parts per trillion in your blood. And that's considered to be not dangerous. At least they don't see a lot of health problems related to that. We believe that any amount is too dangerous to accept, but there's certain levels that they know raises the incidence of disease and the risk of developing diseases and adverse health effects that are associated with PFCs. And when you start getting above that level that everybody has in their blood, then you start seeing those diseases go up. And I'll talk a little bit about that, about a study they did in Bucks County. So that's the problem. It's highly toxic, tiny doses, and it's everywhere. I mean, it's even in polar bears. They found it everywhere. So Pennsylvania really has not responded well to this problem. Now, one of the issues, of course, is that the Department of Defense is involved in this, and they also have been very slow to respond in a coordinated way across the nation effectively to remove completely these compounds from the environment and drinking water and to begin the real cleanup that needs to happen in order to get the stuff out of the environment. But 18 states have taken some action. Now, it isn't enough, but there are other states doing things. And we've been advocating for Pennsylvania to get off, really start moving forward, get on the stick, and start developing regulations. And I'll talk a little bit specifically about what regulations we want them to move ahead with. But other states have addressed groundwater and drinking water. They also have worked on putting in place levels that you have to clean the soil and water up to, what they call remediation levels. Also, when you think about it, okay, well, how are you going to stop it from being spread? You've got to put standards in place that limit the amount in effluent that goes out into the environment. I mean, we have it in the Neshaminy Creek because stormwater is discharged from one of the military facilities into a tributary that runs to the Neshaminy Creek, and downstream from there is Aqua Pennsylvania's intake for drinking water, including our office at Delaware Riverkeeper Network. 10 states have actually promulgated some sort of regulation. That's not good enough, but 10 states have done it, and one state has actually adopted a mandatory safe drinking water standard, or what's called a maximum contaminant level, and that's New Jersey, and that was for that one chemical I mentioned that makes the durable plastics. That's PFNA, and that was in 2018, last year, and it's 13 parts per trillion. So that was recommended in New Jersey by a New Jersey Drinking Water Quality Institute, and I have links in the PowerPoint that is going to be available online, and you can go and read a lot more about it. There's thousands of pages of information and scientific studies that they are required to do a risk assessment based on in order to set a maximum contaminant level. So, Pennsylvania has a problem, but we also have a solution. Pennsylvania's Safe Drinking Water Act has in it the ability to establish and enforce drinking water standards to ensure the supply of safe drinking water to the public. And that has been entrusted to the Pennsylvania Environmental Quality Board. That board has never adopted any MCL in Pennsylvania, ever. In the 1980s, when the Pennsylvania Safe Drinking Water Act was adopted based on the federal Safe Drinking Water Act, they were given that ability, but they've gone along with what the federal government has done. So we talked about what the states have done. The federal government has done very little. They have not adopted a federal safe drinking water standard that then would apply to all of the states. You could make it stricter in your own state, but they don't even have the bottom line. They have not set in place any mandatory standard. They do have a health advisory level, and we're going to talk about that, but it's not adequate, and it's just an advisory level. So Pennsylvania can use its powers. As a matter of fact, it is required that it step up and exercise its authority under the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Environmental Quality Board, to adopt safe drinking water standards when the population is being exposed to a dangerous toxin like the PFCs. Now, the Safe Drinking Water Act recognizes, and I think it's worth actually reading this. It's not very long, but this is the Environmental Rights Amendment of the Pennsylvania Constitution, Article 1, Section 27, and it is actually cited in the Safe Drinking Water Act for Pennsylvania, and kind of lays the groundwork and says right out, what our rights are as citizens, as people. The people have a right to clean air, pure water, and to the preservation of the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment. And this second part is really important. Pennsylvania's public natural resources are the common property of all the people, including generations yet to come. Just think about that. It's not just us today, it's generations yet to come. As trustee of these resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all the people, not some of the people, not the people that don't live close by and are getting the toxins in their drinking water, everybody equally. So this is really what should move the Environmental Quality Board in the state of Pennsylvania to take action in order to set safe drinking water standards and other regulatory measures. So what has Pennsylvania done? Well, Governor Wolf did set what he's put in place through an executive order, what he calls the PFAS Action Team. This executive order was done in 2018, towards the end, in the fall of last year, and they have promised that they're looking into this. Now, they had one public meeting so far. Many of the people, myself included, who've been involved in this, or residents who live around the military bases in Bucks and Montgomery counties, went out to Harrisburg and testified. There was an opportunity to do that. And they have an open record, the PFAS Action Team, until April 1st for people to weigh in for what they think about this issue. So that's the action alert I talked about. And I'm actually just going to pass it and ask you to pass it around. If you want to take it one way, if you could pass it that way. And there's a sample letter on the back of this action alert, but it gives you background information to start with, explains what the problem is, and then there's a letter telling Governor Wolf, wait a minute, you established this PFAS action team, but you did not in any measure talk about the Environmental Quality Board establishing a mandatory safe drinking water standard, which would actually take the stuff out of the drinking water that people have to drink every day. So it's really, really important that the governor add that as an action to the PFAS action team, and that's what that letter that I'm passing around is asking him to do through that team. If you're interested, you can sign it and hand it back to me and we'll mail them in. Otherwise, you can mail them to the governor's address yourself, but you're welcome to do that, and you can keep the page with the background information. But there's this, again, in the PowerPoint, which will be online, here's a link that will show you just what they're doing and the portal that you can use in order to submit comments up till April 1st. So it's a limited period of time, only a few weeks left in this. So I want to address here what the federal government is doing, because you might be saying, well, wait a minute, how come this is such a big national problem? What is the EPA doing? Isn't that their responsibility under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act? And yes, that's true. But what they have done is set what's called a health advisory level, and that's 70 parts per trillion, okay? Now, you hear critics of regulation of perfluorinated compounds and other toxins, but particularly PFAS, say that parts per trillion, that's so tiny, that's so little, and it's only because you can now measure to that level that you can even find it, and we don't have to go down that far. The point is, it's toxic basically at the level you can measure it at. Now, accurate measurement in a laboratory is important, and there has been a lot of advancement in the science of that. And as a result, labs can actually measure PFAS in drinking water down to just a few parts per trillion, between 3 and 5, 6 parts per trillion. And it depends on the lab, and depends on which of the PFC compounds. By the way, there's thousands of them, but the ones that we're focusing on are the ones that we see the most in the environment, in the general population, and in this area. So that 70 parts per trillion, just to put it into perspective, is either individually, PFOA and PFOS, or combined. And the New Jersey Drinking Water Quality Institute has said that they think that for PFOS, it should be 13 parts per trillion, and for PFOA, 14 parts per trillion. This is a huge difference. And the difference is that many people who have levels between that 13 and 14 and 70 will continue to drink contaminated water. And in most cases, they won't even know that they have it. The Department of Defense, even though this is only advisory, is using the health advisory level, 70 parts per trillion, as the trigger for action. So if you live in the communities around there and you just were subject to what the Department of Defense has decided to do in terms of action, you are going to be only helped if your water is above 70 parts per trillion or above of PFOA or PFOS, or the two combined. So communities around that area have said no. many of the, particularly the closest ones, where the bulk of people, 70,000 people, live. And most of those communities have said, we don't want any in our water. We want it taken down to what's called non-detect, or that level that I said you can, the labs can find it at. And so when they take it, so in order to take it down to that level, what they've done is either dilute the water. They've definitely shut down many wells, but they've diluted the water, or they've imported water, surface water, that does not have PFCs in it. And that is the temporary measure that they've taken in order to deliver what they feel is, importantly, the safest drinking water they can, with no detection of PFCs at all. That's very expensive. A couple of the towns have announced that they're going to be suing the military in order to try to get reimbursement for the expense of doing this, because what has happened is the water bills have gone up for the people, particularly in the one community that they've had to buy the water to come in, to be PFC free. So this is the problem that has been created by having a health advisory level, because it's only advisory and because it's so artificially high, that we then, communities are just left on their own to try to figure out, how do we get safe drinking water to people? And people need to speak up, and that's why these local communities have taken this action, because people have spoken up and said, no, wait a minute. Just like that first slide I showed you, no level of PFAS is safe. We don't want it at all in our water. It's not naturally there. It's a man-made chemical. It's escaped into the environment. It's highly toxic, and it has very dangerous health effects. Now, in the fact sheet I passed out, it talks a little bit about health effects. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, except to let you know that there are several diseases and adverse health conditions that are linked, or what they call correlated, with exposure to PFAS. And I'm going to explain a little bit in this next slide about why Delaware Riverkeeper Network is advocating for PFOA between 1 and 6 parts per trillion, and for PFOS 5 parts per trillion, which is the levels, basically at the levels of non-detect. So this slide tells it all in terms of the EPA health advisory level and why it's not protective of human health. This is 70 parts per trillion. And if people drink water at 70 parts per trillion, they're going to see PFCs build up in their blood to this level. It's about 100 times. And the predicted increases are between 5-fold and 8-fold, depending on how much water you drink every day. And the health effects that are associated with exposure to those chemicals occur at those levels. So if you're drinking water that has PFCs in it at a level that is associated or correlated or linked to certain diseases, then the risk of developing that disease is greater for you drinking that water.
How about bathing?
Bathing is not as big a pathway because it's not absorbed dermally, but it is inhaled, so you have to be careful about showering. We can talk a little more about some of the ways that can treat it. But New Jersey's Drinking Water Quality Institute Health Effects Subcommittee is the ones that made this slide up to illustrate why 70 parts per trillion is not protective of human health. This issue has now become very big, and different states are bringing this issue up, and they're advocating that the EPA take action. Now, EPA did have a press conference about 3 weeks ago and said that they are beginning the next stage of what could turn into a rulemaking to set MCLs or maximum contaminant levels for PFOA and PFOS. And they said for 1 year they're going to be going through this process, and at the end of the year they're going to say whether or not they are actually going to start setting the risk assessment process and all the analysis they need to do to actually set a maximum contaminant level that would be federally applicable. Of course, that's the most just thing to do, right? Because it's not fair. You don't want people who don't have states that are setting MCLs like New Jersey to be, favored over people who live in states that don't have those standards. And the Department of Defense using the EPA HAL is certainly not protecting human health either. I meant to mention the health effects are kidney cancer, testicular cancer, ulcerative colitis, developmental effects on particularly fetus, infants and young children, and preeclampsia. So it's really, really important that women of childbearing age, for instance, should not be drinking water that has PFCs in it. Because it takes so long to be excreted by the body and it's not metabolized well, you could stop drinking it 5 years before and you could still affect the fetus developing in your body. And developmental effects, of course, are devastating because it can mark a child for life if they're not developing properly. Low birth weight, a smaller head size, certain other neurological and developmental effects are associated with certain PFCs. And then also you could develop a disease earlier in life as a result of your exposure in the womb or as a young child. And one of the reasons for this is, and it's on the next slide, and I did not include that slide because it's too much in the weeds, but infants, children, they drink more water per body weight than adults do. That's why they actually get more affected than adults do by drinking water that's tainted with PFAS. And that's one of the reasons why it's unconscionable that the federal government has not taken action, that Pennsylvania has not already taken action. So the Drinking Water Quality Institute in other states, Vermont, New Hampshire is moving ahead, New York State is moving ahead, some of the states out west where they've had a lot of 3M exposure are moving ahead. But New Jersey has conclusions show that the health advisory is not sufficiently protective. And this is a little bit in the weeds for today, but bottom line, they didn't look at the endpoints that a risk assessment looks at when they do the toxicological analysis that's required. And they also did not look at that information that I had in that slide, the way it builds up in the blood. And you must do that if you're going to be able to say, okay, it's safe or not safe to drink at a certain level. Yes?
How can you be certain that the replacement product is not as bad or worse than
you can.
what is being replaced?
You can, and I'm going to get to that in a minute, and remind me if I don't, but there's a slide. So I just want to say that Delaware Riverkeeper Network filed a petition in 2017, in May of 2017, with the Pennsylvania Environmental Quality Board, saying that we wanted them to set an MCL for PFOA. We only had the information on PFOA at that time because that's what New Jersey Drinking Water Quality Institute had completed. We followed up the next year with sending them all the information on PFOS because New Jersey then recommended through their Drinking Water Quality Institute that 13 parts per trillion that I mentioned for PFOS. So we filed this petition. It's an administrative process. They're supposed to respond. They have not responded to our petition. We have been advocating through every means we possibly can to get them to respond. There was an announcement that was made just within the last 10 days, I think it was, by Pennsylvania DEP saying that they are going to start the process of looking at setting an MCL for PFOA and PFOS. They did say that. We haven't seen anything in writing yet. We don't know what that process is. The action team is supposed to start some sampling this spring. It really was supposed to have been started already in January. It was delayed. They say it's going to happen this spring. So that data will be very important to find out where it is and then zero in on people who are actually drinking the water first and make sure that they're taken off that water. Military facilities, for instance, typically give bottled water out until a replacement water can be provided. And then also then to zero in on the sources of contamination. It's not good enough just to remove it from the drinking water. We have to remove it from the environment. You have to actually get it out of the environment or it will be forever a problem, and forever people will be exposed to it in one way or another if it's in the environment. So the Delaware Riverkeeper Network engaged a toxicologist, an independent toxicologist, and that's where we came up with our recommendation of 1 to 6 parts per trillion for the PFOA, and for PFOS, a lower level of 5, depending on how you can measure it. Some of that has to do with the sensitivity that labs can measure it at. But bottom line, EPA's announcement, Pennsylvania DEP's announcement, these are all great, but we need action. And really, action should have been taken yesterday. It should have been taken, when we filed our petition, we handed to them thousands of pages of a risk assessment and scientific data that was put through a rigorous process at the Drinking Water Quality Institute in New Jersey that they could have just acted on at that moment. But they said they didn't have a toxicologist, they said they didn't have the staff, they said they didn't have the money, and then eventually they formed this team that sidelined the EQB. We're really frustrated. And we think that people should not be drinking water that's toxic, and in most cases don't even know that they're drinking that water. So the health impacts are becoming more known locally. It's the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, they have a pilot study that they funded, and there are grants that were that in Bucks and Montgomery County, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the findings of that. And they just awarded 8 military-based regions studies to do blood sampling and other health analyses to find out what is the impact of drinking this water on communities that have been exposed. So that's a good start. It's important to get that information. The Department of Health, with this CDC ATSDR funding, did a survey near the bases in Bucks County, and the results, I went to the meeting and I can tell you it's stunning results. And it showed higher concentrations of PFOA, PFOS, another one of these PFCs, PFHXS, and PFNA in the blood of those that were tested. And this was not an epidemiological study, so they have a caveat on it to say you can't reach conclusions, but they looked at it to find out, was this correlated with any disease incidence? And there is a higher incidence of elevated cholesterol. I didn't mention that, but that's one of the very dangerous health effects of PFOA and PFOS, endocrine disruption, and cancer. So just think about that. People have been drinking this water for decades. They didn't know it had these toxins in it. And now they're finding out that some of the suspicions they've had, like everybody in my cul-de-sac has cancer, or whatever the anecdotal experiences of the community, that some of it has been caused, or that could have been caused by exposure through drinking water to these compounds. So we've been working in the community for some time. This was in 2016, where a rally in Horsham Township. People have been clamoring for blood testing for a while. People want to know, what has this done? People want to know, I'm pregnant, should I move out of the community? There's a lot of questions in terms of personal decisions that people need to make by having the proper information. And they want to know, do I have it in my blood? Should I expect that this is going to expose me, to a greater risk of developing disease? And again, we have a constitutional right to clean water. Pennsylvania is one of the few states, there's only 2 states that have a strong environmental rights amendment like we have. So we feel that at Delaware Riverkeeper Network, that pushing based on that will get us a long way, and that's what we're doing. A lot of people in the communities have really stepped up and become very involved in this issue. And our concern is that, remember the lead, in the lead crisis, and then it kind of blew over? That's what we're concerned about, that right now there's a lot of very important attention being paid to this issue by some of the agencies, but we haven't seen the action yet in order to actually remove these toxins from our drinking water replacements. So when EPA found out that these toxins were being found in the blood of polar bears and in 97% of everybody who lives in the United States, and then they found out that there were actually toxic effects of exposure, and that was related to workers and also related to a lawsuit brought in the early 2000s in West Virginia and Ohio at the Washington Works plant, which was a DuPont plant, and they found incidents of this in the water as a result of Rob Ballot, a pioneering, a very creative and committed attorney, brought a lawsuit against DuPont. And when they found all that out, a lawsuit was brought, the judge ordered a study. And experts were put in place, and they looked at the population of people, which was actually similar to the population here, around 70,000 people, that had been drinking this water for years. And they found the diseases that I mentioned earlier, the cancers and the high cholesterol and the preeclampsia and thyroid dysfunction. But they found 6 diseases that were definitely correlated according to the data. And they, as a result of that, it's perverse. People were used as guinea pigs. But as a result of that, it's rare that we really have human data that's as clear as that. Usually, because risk assessments, of course, for ethical reasons, are done using animals, not human beings. But we do have that data. So that what EPA did is that they ordered further sampling to be done. That was done, that study I mentioned between 2013 and 2015 of large water systems across the United States. That's when this community here found out that it was, and most everybody in the United States who now know they have it in their water found out. It's because of that sampling. And the other thing EPA did at that time is they issued what's called a stewardship program. It was voluntary for all the major manufacturers, 10 of them, using PFCs to phase it out. And so they had until 2015 to do that. They did that, but they replaced it with other chemicals because they're still making the plastics. They're still making, you can see what they call green Teflon. And you can buy, cookware with green Teflon, but it's made with replacement chemicals. The replacement chemicals being used in firefighting foams. So these chemicals are not necessarily safe. And one of the things that they found out is a lot of them were approved by EPA. They had a program set up, a process that EPA had to go through in order to look at these replacement compounds. And most of them were given a green light pretty quickly. And the ones that are in use, they now have, oh my gosh, they're finding them in the environment. Well, what does it say when you're finding them in the environment? Well, they're not breaking down, and then they're finding out they're not breaking down as much as they thought, as quickly as they thought they would break down. And then they find out, wait a minute, they're associated with some of the same diseases because they've been doing studies and finding this out. So Gen X is one of them, and in North Carolina they have a big problem there with the Gen X. Gen X is also being imported to DuPont, which is on the Delaware River in New Jersey. It's now Chemours. It's the old DuPont Chambers Works plant. It's now run by Chemours. And Chemours imports it and uses it there. There are replacement compounds being used at the facility that was responsible for releasing most of that PFNA I talked about that is so highly toxic. It's more toxic at lower doses than PFOA because it has more carbons in the chain. It's 9 carbon in the chain. So as a result of that, it was found around this facility, Solvay, on the New Jersey side of the river, and they made replacements. And now we don't know if those replacements are safe. So they have found actually the replacements in soil around that facility, according to a recent scientific paper. So the problem is not really being dealt with the way that it should be. And one of the issues that we see is that there is an institutional stubbornness about this. A lot of it has to do with status quo. A lot of it has to do with the influence that big manufacturers and the Department of Defense, unfortunately, bring to the table. But people are speaking up, and that's making a difference. So, I mean, at this point, I think I'd like to open it up to questions and see if anybody has specific questions. I'm sorry to leave it so much up in the air that we have a big problem, but I think we do also have the solution. And for individuals in their homes, you can get tests done to find out if it's in your tap water, particularly if you have a private well. It costs about $250, and we can talk further, and actually in our PowerPoint, I'm not sure if it's in the PowerPoint, but there's labs in the area that do that sampling. So, we'll be happy to share that with you. but mainly through your regular results, test results that you get with your water bill. If you're on a municipal or a regional water system, you will see PFCs if it has been detected as a problem in your area. You won't see it otherwise because they're not regulated. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions and see if anybody wants to delve into something further.
Is it do all the municipal waters have to have it tested?
No.
So just because it's not there doesn't mean it's not there.
Exactly. That's exactly right. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? It's John Locke. I mean, and the point is that just because you don't know that it's in your water doesn't mean it's not in there. And when you look at the population of Pennsylvania, the majority of people have never had their water tested. So it's only a few hot spots that have been tested, mainly Bucks and Montgomery County, and they haven't even completed the sampling in any of the other places except for the few that were on that list that I showed you. And they're ongoing. Yes?
I have a two-part question. It has to do with the solution you talked about. You said that 97% of the population has PFAS in their blood, which is correct. But that's 3% that doesn't. Like, is there any data that we can learn from that 3%? Like, are they in what geographic areas are they in? Do they have different types of water treatment? Like, is there anything that we can get from that?
No.
That 3%?
No, I'm sorry, but from what I understand, it's because they live in areas where it wasn't released.
Okay.
Okay. And also there is treatment. I'm glad you brought that up. The places that have put treatment in, they use activated carbon. So the granular activated carbon is the typical filtration system that's put in place. Reverse osmosis is another treatment that's very effective. It's more expensive. Sometimes people in their private homes will use a combination of granular activated carbon and reverse osmosis, but generally they're finding in the communities where they have identified that it's in the water, using a granular activated filtration system completely removes it. So this is not rocket science. We know how to remove it, and there are places that are already doing it, particularly in New Jersey, and it's successful. So removing it does make a difference. The other exposure pathways that I mentioned through consumer products, you do have control over that. You can, unfortunately, it's not required for them to disclose for a commercial outfit to disclose if they've used PFCs. But I mean, when you see something that's water repellent, you can go online and look up the product, and you can even get in touch with the company to find out if it's because they are using PFC coatings. They're in just about every durable plastic product you can think of, and any sort of coating on a surface in order to repel water or stains. Usually it's because of PFCs. They're ubiquitous in the environment. Does that answer your?
It does.
Yeah. Yes.
Sorry, I have to make your story more grim.
Pardon?
I have to
Oh,
make your
more
story
grim?
more grim.
Oh, okay.
And this comes from professional experience. All of those bases you described use heavy equipment. I guarantee you under every one of them there's a trichloroethylene plume. Because the hardest job on any military base is the environmental compliance officer, and they usually give it to someone below the rank of captain who is not going to argue with the major or the colonel.
Right.
And has a bunch of young people who don't feel like hauling it across the base to get it properly disposed of, so they dump it. And trichloroethylene mixed with that, we don't know what it does except it's really, really bad.
Right.
And you can remediate that, but not remediating the TCE, because the test you're talking about will test for your particular substance, and if it's not filtering out the TCE, many of the same cancers or related cancers can get through. And one of the other red flags really is go through the DoD's base closure list.
Yep.
They will tell you it's because of operations, but I can tell you Lejeune and El Toro did not get closed down because of base operations. They got closed down because of TCE. It's famous court cases that the Marines lost. The guys at Fort Bragg filed for one, They won and then had it reversed by a federal judge. And just to add further misery to the soup, all the businesses associated with creating that are what's called ITAR. They create something that's important for national security, and good luck at regulating them. They have a whole layer of regulations that go with them that really the only thing I've ever found that works is shame.
Right.
Shame coming of documenting the health problems of the community, because we had this problem in the community with TCE and Superior Tube down in Collegeville. And it was finally, dumb luck that they were next to the Perkiomen Creek and public chain. And they switched to a different chemical, which is a better chemical, but still cancer-causing agent.
Right, you're absolutely right. The military bases, there's only one that's still operating that was the source of these chemicals, and that's the Horsham Air Guard. The others are closed, and they're all Superfund sites. And pretty much most of the military sites that are closed are Superfund sites. And they were already undergoing remediation for TCE, volatile organic compounds, basically jet fuel and all of the various compounds that they use, day in and day out on a military base. This particular family of chemicals flew under the radar, though. It was ones that they were not testing for. Most labs were not even set up to test for it, and it could be needed to be detected in such tiny amounts that it really was not known whether or not the level that you had was dangerous or not. So they just weren't testing. I mean, one of the problems with the EPA analysis that they did when that sampling I talked about that they required, they had the reporting level up way too high. And because they did not have to test all the way down to what I call the detect level, or 3, 4, 5 parts per trillion, they were instead testing up 20 and 40 parts per trillion. They missed all these places that actually have it in their water, and those places still today do not know they have it. So this is why we need to investigate, and I think the cleanup programs that are going on at the military bases, as this gentleman said, they're ongoing, but they're problematic too. There was a hearing held just this week in Washington, D.C., in the House. And the House, and a local person, several local people went to the hearing, and a couple of our local congressmen, like Congressman Fitzpatrick, testified, and others brought up issues before the committee. And they're looking into, what can be done about this huge issue that we have of PFCs, but also the general, expense of cleaning up these military bases, which are the major source of PFOS and PFOA nationwide. Now, the manufacturers, DuPont and 3M, they're devils too. I think that one of the names of one of the movies is The Devil You Know, that has just come out. Yeah, and so that's. That's because they have done plenty in terms of releasing it into the environment as well. But yes, it's problematic, and there's some estimates of how many billions and billions it will cost to clean it up. But you know what? What is our health worth? And actually, Safe Drinking Water Act does not require a cost-benefit analysis, because the human race needs to survive, and our health, you can't put a price on our health. Other questions? Yes.
I was just curious. I know that DuPont has been getting a little bit of press because they started.
The who?
DuPont has been getting a little bit of press because they started manufacturing reverse osmosis filtration systems in order to remove the poisons that they put in there. And I was wondering if all reverse osmosis filtration systems do that, or if you have to have a special one.
You don't have to have a special one.
Oh, okay.
Granular activated carbon and reverse osmosis are both being used. And there's some other innovative technologies that are emerging now, other ways of removing it. The thing that we have to realize is that once you remove it, then you have to do something with it. And it doesn't neutralize it.
Right.
So then it has to be stored. And most of the new sort of technological advances are looking at how can you actually break it down. I mean, they're talking about, they know burning it, for instance, but then there's air emissions as a result. So it's a problem. It's sort of like, when everyone started, I was looking at the Limerick Towers driving here, and everyone, was very concerned about what are we going to do with all this radioactive material and where are we going to store the waste. It's very similar to that. needs to be stored away from the environment and people for a very long time, and until we can, because it doesn't break down, until we can figure out how to actually neutralize the material. That's the problem with making these very strong compounds that have a benefit because they don't break down, and you can make a jet engine out of them, but the flip side of that is they don't break down in the environment or in people, and they're highly toxic. Other questions?
Yeah, on the
Yes.
replacement chemicals that you were talking about, do they test them prior to putting them in?
EPA does an analysis, but it was really more of a waving their hand over them. They did some analysis, but they did not do enough analysis because they said Gen X was safe, and now they're finding out that it has toxic health effects. And they said that it would break down quicker, and they're finding it in the environment a lot longer than they thought it would take to break it down. So that's the problem. They're supposed to do more rigorous analysis of these replacements. As a matter of fact, it seems so perverse.
They legally can't do more analysis.
Excuse me?
They legally cannot do more analysis. There's a thing called the Toxic Substances Control Act.
Yes.
That substance is not on the act.
They can add it to the toxic.
It's much more restricted in its regulations,
Right.
and it's why they find replacement chemicals.
But they can add it to the toxic
They can, I'm
substances
just telling you,
control.
but
Right.
with the answer to that question, the process to add a chemical to that list is Homeric.
Yes,
There are
but it
over
needs to be done.
10,000 toxic chemicals, there are about 300 on the list.
And you bring up a good point, because I did mention there's other regulatory actions that we think should be taken. One of them is to add the PFCs, particularly the ones that are the most commonly found, and there's about 14 of them, to add them to the Toxic Substances Control Act list. And then also under the Community Right to Know law and some other regulations, adding PFCs as toxic materials will then put extra layers of control over how you gather and handle the material and how you dispose of it. I mean, one of the ways that PFCs, particularly PFOA and PFOS and PFNA, are spread in the environment is through sludge from wastewater or drinking water treatment plants. So a treatment plant filters this stuff out, it gets in the sludge, then what they're doing with the sludge, particularly from the wastewater treatment facilities, is applying it as biosolids on farm fields. And then it gets into the food and the soil and the water miles and miles away from where it was generated. And we know this from studies that are being done. In New Jersey, they found it on the other side of the state from where it originated. And then doing research across the nation, they're finding that they're testing the biosolids and finding PFCs concentrated in the sludge. So if it was regulated as a hazardous substance, then they would have to test for that before it went into the biosolid, and they wouldn't be able to just willy-nilly apply it on farm fields and then having it move further into the environment and expose more people to it. So that's one of the things. The hazardous substances is another. The other list there is to add it to the requirements for effluent sampling and then removal if you find it. That's under a different regulation. So there's a lot of different, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System regulations. So there's a lot of different regulatory measures that can be taken. So I take exception with you saying it's illegal. It's illegal because it's not added.
Well,
but we can change that. There is a mechanism in that law for adding new substances, so it can be done. Yes.
Listening to this conversation really makes you feel like you're fighting a losing battle, because you look back and realize how we had to struggle against the lead. The lead's over, and it just transferred over to something else.
Mm-hmm.
And you get the feeling that you get this squared away, and you don't have anything to prevent you just moving on to something else.
It's a good point. It's a good point. And one of the things about putting treatment on your water systems that's beneficial is it does remove a lot of the granular activated carbon and reverse osmosis removes a whole host of pollutants. So one of the things that's actually being talked about is going the other way. Rather than making maximum contaminant levels or safe drinking water standards for each PFC or other chemicals as well, to require the treatment at the end that's known to remove those and require it on all water systems. And that might be where you go, but that's kind of a more global way to go at it, and it is being considered. There's a lot of problems with it because certain PFCs are not effectively removed by granular, mainly the replacements. The very short carbon chain PFCs are not effectively removed just by granular activated carbon. And a combination of treatment systems does remove them. But, so you get into how long a treatment train do you put in and where do you put it? Bottom line, we need to know where the material is. We need to know where these compounds are and expose that information to the public. Everybody needs to know whether or not this is a problem, and the communities who are delivering water need to know. Are they, protecting their customers, the residents that are drinking their water through the water treatment they do provide? And so the first step really is to find out where it is and then to remove it whenever it's found, mandatorily, not on a voluntary basis. I think we can get there. I think the problem is we're finding out more problems because we're looking, but keeping your head in the sand doesn't make them go away. We wonder, why do we have such a high cancer rate? Why do we have these health problems seemingly as an epidemic? And a lot of it has to do with exposure to chemical compounds in our drinking water and places that we don't suspect that they are. Yes.
I was just thinking, like, even though they would come up with an accepted level of what the water should be, we're not really sure whether or not they're actually giving us the truth, because if they're going high and going real low and leaving out stuff in the middle, it's sort of, to me, it's like deception.
Yeah.
So
it is always a problem.
Hence my comment of it being illegal.
Yeah.
Because according to the guidelines, it's 78 parts per trillion. If the EPA finds anything below that threshold, they cannot, by administrative law, report it out. That's the threshold.
Well, they can report it. They can make it public.
But it's not actionable. The EPA cannot prosecute. Right?
That's why the states
when Congress passes a law, administrative law is then created. What the guidelines are for the administrative law is what the agency can do, which stinks. But that's the reality we work with.
Agree that we need to improve those laws and add it to the federal TSCA list. However, that's why states need to take action. That's why because Pennsylvania can take action beyond that. And New Jersey already has, and other states are actually taking action and requiring removal, no matter where it comes from. And different military bases right now are grappling with this very issue because states are putting in place standards that are mandatory and are lower than the 70 parts per trillion. So there's all kinds of arguments going on. Do they have to follow EPA, or because they're a federal agency, or do they have to follow the state standards? I say, Delaware Riverkeeper Network says, they need to follow the state standards. They need to protect every person who drinks water. Yes, hand up back there.
So, Aqua Pennsylvania, who I work for, I actually do a lot of the sampling. I work in source water protection, and we're a real victim of the Air National Guard base, and we've been kind of policing them and taking samples out.
Where are you?
Aqua Pennsylvania. So, and what we've done is put together a website called waterfacts.com, where you can get your most recent PFAS results in the finished drinking water, and it's pretty user-friendly, and that's something that's voluntary, and we've been using activated carbon for a long time, thankfully, before we even knew about this, but I think our latest estimate is like $1 million a day we're spending at the Neshaminy plant just to take this stuff out to the degree that we're able to currently. So I think without regulation forcing the funding to be spent, and without a mechanism to fund it, it does become an issue.
Is your trigger for action 70 parts per trillion?
Well, that's the regulation that's handed down to us, but
Yeah.
we're exceeding that everywhere.
You are?
Yes, and you can check out waterfacts.com.
What is your action level?
I mean, that's our action level. That's the regulation. That's the only.
But I mean,
action
if you
level.
find it below 70 parts per trillion, but you are detecting it, are you removing it?
We can only go. I mean, we're regulated by the Pennsylvania Utility Commission on how we can spend each dollar. we're regulated by EPA, we're regulated by PADEP, in terms of our action levels or what we're required to do if we found it above that. But we've shut down wells anywhere close to that. We've just taken them out of production, and we're using a ton of granular activated carbon in our plants.
Some
And you can
water
check out-
authorities, like in the communities right around the base, have gone to non-detect. It's not that you can't do it; it's a decision whether or not to do it. Also in New Jersey, New Jersey American Water Company is removing it to non-detect in the community next to the DuPont facility, where they had such a PFOA problem they discovered back in 2005. So it's not that you can't
And
take the action; it's that it's a decision to be made.
I do know that so in terms of what Pennsylvania has done, I know Penn Vest has helped to fund a lot of the improvements for the well systems in that area. And I know it is a priority for the Wolf administration and talking to their folks. But I would stress to everybody here that if they want to know what's in their drinking water, that they look at their CCRs from, if you're on public water, check out your consumer confidence report, which wouldn't have this on it, you're right, but we voluntarily put that out on our website for PFAS. But all of the other information, all of the regulated contaminants, any exceedances or any results would have to be reported in those CCRs. And that's what you want to find. It's available through DEP's website.
So,
more information.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question
that.
about that?
Yes.
The removal is taking $1 million a day over and above what you'd be, say, just as a.
Which we're not required to do because
Well,
there's
yeah.
no regulation.
But my question is, can you make a rate case to recover that cost? Because then you're getting to the PUC and you can't.
You can't
by
say we're
law,
forced to
because
do
it's
this.
it's a private, it's a private utility.
It's
and
a
they have to
business
answer the
decision.
PUC and to their stockholders. So if you want to get that done, you have to be able to make a rate case that you can recover the cost.
I don't work in that area of the company, but I would think that because it's not a regulated contaminant, our case to the PUC to increase our customers' costs to pay for that'd be a hard.
That's my point.
That would be a hard argument to make when when it's like, well, you're already meeting, you're
But
already meeting, why?
I think that also in New Jersey, when New Jersey American did it, they made a business decision to supply clean water free of PFCs, and they ate the cost.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was a good business decision to deliver
but
clean water.
But to hit your target of getting it out of everywhere for at least anybody on public water, without the regulation, it's maybe, that's
It's
where
not
you
all
should go.
borne by one company though. There's a lot, there's municipal authorities, there's
Yeah,
water
I'm not
authorities,
saying you
there's
can't,
Aqua
but it's an uphill
PA.
battle.
It's uphill battle, but it's distributed out. And also, for instance, the companies that are responsible for this are being sued as well.
Mhm.
And they're hoping to recover. The communities are hoping to recover money from, across the U.S., from DuPont, Chemours, 3M, Wolverine. They used it on their boots. It's been a big source out in the Midwest. So there's all sorts of sources that are being sued in order to get this. It's a shame that all that time and money has to be spent to sue, the responsible polluters. But that is the route that it's required because there's been so little action from the government. There's going to be a movie coming out about Rob Bilott, and there was a great New York Times piece about him, DuPont's Worst Nightmare or something like that was the name of it, and he began back in the early 2000s, and I just heard that it's going to be coming out in the next year. I think that story might help us, just like a lot of the great documentaries that are coming out, help us to have companies step up and say, okay, maybe I can't recover this money through my rates, but I'm going to go ahead and do it because I want to deliver clean water, safe water. But I knew we're at 3 o'clock right now, and I'm happy to talk with people afterwards, but I think there's a wrap up downstairs. So thank you all very much.